Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 42, Life, the Universe, and Everything. Wait, no, that's not right. This is Blockbuster Films Part 2, Superheroes Go Mainstream. Superheroes are sort of a side branch off of science fiction. In fact, all the way back in episode 1, I talked about how superheroes are sometimes considered a separate genre from sci-fi. Bookstores and libraries tend to have 4 labels under the broad umbrella of speculative fiction: science fiction, fantasy, horror, and comic books, suggesting that they are something different. Now, I also said that I define science fiction broadly as any speculative fiction that doesn't fall under a different label, since we need to be able to include things like dystopias and alternate histories. What about comic books? They're often put under a separate label, but that's just the thing. We say comic books and graphic novels, not superheroes. They aren't a different genre, they're a different format. If you look for prose novels about superheroes, I'm pretty sure they'll be in the science fiction section, so I consider them fair game for this podcast. First, we do need to back up a bit and look at how superheroes got started, because I've mostly glossed over them when I've brought them up before. Superhero stories are generally considered to have grown out of the tales of heroes and demigods in ancient myths and legends, and this is one area where the purported ancient origins of the genre seem to be absolutely correct. You can find stories of heroes with exceptional or superhuman abilities saving people from villains and monsters all the way back to Gilgamesh. You have Hercules with his super strength, King Arthur with his magic sword, Robin Hood, who is what in the business is called a badass normal. No powers, but better enough than everyone else to make him a hero. All of these figures are classics of literature today. And badass normals were probably more typical of the 19th century, where swashbuckling heroes only needed to be superhumanly competent rather than superhumanly powerful. Also, the existence of real-life masked vigilantes in the Old West probably helped along the image of the superhero as a masked crime fighter. But that was a ways off yet. Science fiction came into it during the rise of pulp fiction, where it began to give superheroes real powers outside of fantasy. The brilliant scientist-type superhero, like Iron Man, started to appear with the Edison Age, which grew rapidly in popularity in the 1890s, where an inventor has adventures and often saves the day with an impossible invention. As for intrinsic powers, there may be earlier examples, but the trope was definitely established by 1912 with Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter, who gained superhuman strength in Mars' low gravity, perhaps prefiguring Superman. From there, pulp fiction carried the genre along, with larger-than-life heroes like Zorro and The Shadow. The pulp stories were already popular ones to adapt to comic strips and comic books, so it's not surprising that comics began creating their own characters, including the Phantom. In 1938, Superman made his debut in Action Comics, and the rest is history. But I want to talk specifically about movies in this episode, because superhero movies are an interesting case. They weren't seen as a viable genre initially, and in fact they were nearly absent from the industry for many years. Comic books got a bad rap for a long time, and for a much more fundamental reason than the moral panic of the 50s that led to the Comics Code Authority. Their biggest problem was that they were seen as being stories for children. In the case of DC, they were specifically aimed at children, while Marvel favored writing for preteens and teenagers. Look at all the superheroes that got Saturday morning cartoons later on, and that meant there wasn't as much appeal to do anything big budget with them. Superheroes first appeared on the big screen in the film serials of the 40s, including Superman, Batman, Captain Marvel, now known as Shazam, The Shadow, and The Phantom. But in the 50s, television killed the format. Or more charitably, the format moved wholesale to television. Film serials were part of a larger matinee format designed to draw in kids for a whole afternoon, with multiple shorts, newsreels, a full-length movie, and sometimes even a double feature. And you had to go back every week to see the resolution of last week's cliffhanger. For a weekly show like that, it just made more sense to broadcast it over the airwaves so kids could watch it at home. And just like that, superheroes disappeared from the theaters. The only major exceptions were Superman and the Mole Men in 1951, which was the pilot for the Adventures of Superman TV show, and the 1966 Batman, which was a film tie-in for that TV show. Superheroes did find a market in other countries like Japan. For example, Godzilla is sometimes considered to have become a superhero after he first fought Ghidorah in 1964. But in America, there was pretty much nothing. What changed? Well, if you've been following this podcast up till now, you may be able to guess. It was Star Wars. Suddenly, a pulp fiction-inspired space opera, remember, George Lucas originally wanted to do Flash Gordon, was having off-the-charts success. This led Hollywood to take another look at other science fiction properties. And only 1 year later, we got the first Superman movie that was actually aimed at the theater-going audience. It probably didn't hurt that the kids who loved the serials in the 40s were now grown up with kids of their own. Nostalgia isn't just a 21st century thing. And Superman 1 was successful. It was top of the box office in '78, virtually tied with Grease. And it single-handedly cracked open Hollywood to the superhero genre. Over the next 2 decades, it led to a steady flow of other superhero films, of which the Tim Burton Batman was only the most notable. There were many other adaptations of older properties like The Shadow, and newer ones like Judge Dredd. The thing is, superheroes still didn't have the kind of star power they have today. Despite the perennial Superman and Batman sequels and other adaptations, they weren't a dominant genre for many years. They were still aimed more at children, and many of the films that were produced weren't that good. Even the original Superman doesn't hold up very well in my opinion. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Time travel ruins any story that's not specifically about time travel. But more importantly, by Superman 4 and Batman and Robin, both series seem to have spun themselves out after multiple flops. Even after all that, the genre still hadn't hit its stride. It was the junior player in the industry, Marvel, that finally did hit that stride in 2000 with X-Men. X-Men was the surprise hit that is credited with kicking off the superhero renaissance that continues to this day. I should add the caveat that some people credit Marvel's 1998 film Blade with starting the superhero renaissance. However, since that's a story about vampires, it feels like a borderline case to me. Like Blade is more a superhero by fiat, by virtue of being part of the Marvel Comics universe. Likewise, some people credit The Matrix with reinventing superheroes for modern film, with things like Bullet Time, despite it being properly a cyberpunk film. However, I don't think there can be any doubt that Marvel dominates the industry today, and has ever since X-Men. Marvel was known for dealing with more serious and mature issues than DC from the beginning, and X-Men didn't disappoint with its obvious civil rights allegory. And what's more, while a lot of comic books and even superhero movies up to that point had lousy and sometimes campy writing, X-Men, well, didn't fully break away from that, but it was more of a standard action movie and brought Hollywood's experience with those to the genre. The result was a pretty good story that, much like the pioneers of CGI I talked about in the last episode, showed the world what superhero movies could really do. Marvel, through its deals with various studios, followed up X-Men with the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man, which was even more of a box office phenomenon. If the superhero renaissance wasn't solidly established yet, Spider-Man certainly clinched it. This then led to many other sequels and adaptations. The Ang Lee Hulk, the 2003 Daredevil, The Punisher, The Fantastic Four, Ghost Rider. And that's all just for Marvel, and many of those still weren't all that good. But finally, we got the 2008 Iron Man, which began the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which has now become the longest theatrical film series of the Blockbuster era. In America, anyway. Leaving James Bond in the dust last year after Shang-Chi. That's why I called this episode Superheroes Go Mainstream. Superheroes weren't a non-entity in sci-fi in 1999. But the past 2 decades have transformed them into one of the most valuable media properties in the world, and that's just for one series. Suddenly, superheroes were cool, and not just for kids anymore. I'm going to assume you're familiar with the MCU, and we don't need to rehash that. I'm also going to assume you're familiar with the new DC superhero properties, the Dark Knight Trilogy and the current DCEU. I'll note in passing here that the Dark Knight trilogy, along with a few others like M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable, brought the quote-unquote realistic superhero story to prominence, creating stories that were almost possible in the real world. And even in the more fantastical stories, that trend is still there. You really don't get the campy, cartoonish type of superhero story anymore, not like you see in the comics. Well, except for Deadpool. I'll also note that with this realism, superhero movies tend to lean more on science fiction proper than the comic books do. The comic books mix super technology, natural powers, fantasy creatures like vampires, and even real magic. For example, magic is explicitly one of Superman's weaknesses in the comics because it bypasses his physical invulnerability. Movies tend not to do things like that. Case in point, Doctor Strange, where in the comics he's a straight-up magic user. The movie makes his power more scientific, by saying he's drawing energy from parallel universes where the laws of physics are different. Another trend that you see in 21st century superhero stories is the deconstruction story. A deconstruction is where you take a trope or even a whole genre and reanalyze it, emphasizing the things that aren't realistic and addressing how they would go in real life. I think all superhero stories that go more realistic are doing this a little bit. Watchmen is kind of the canonical example here. In that one, none of the heroes have powers except for Dr. Manhattan, and anyone who dresses up in a goofy costume to fight crime is probably mentally ill. But another great example that's a bit closer to the original superhero style is Pixar's The Incredibles from 2004. The Incredibles begins as a standard superhero film, but it quickly takes a hard left turn when superheroes start getting sued for the collateral damage they cause when fighting villains. They're technically vigilantes after all, and the fighting often does more damage than the villains would on their own just robbing a bank. So instead of letting the status quo continue, as most superhero stories would, the government takes the more realistic step of making superheroing illegal and putting all the supers into witness protection by another name. That's deconstruction. The Incredibles looks at the deconstruction from a few other angles too. There's the superhero lifestyle causing family problems, of course. The unfairness of the supers having natural advantages over everyone else. The fact that Syndrome kind of has a point when he says it would be better to share his technology with everyone, after he's had his fun, of course. Even small things like when Helen tells the kids that these bad guys aren't like the bad guys in Saturday morning cartoons. There's a lot going on there. And Watchmen and The Incredibles are not the only stories doing this. In the TV series adaptation of Big Hero 6, the chief of police accuses the superheroes of attracting supervillains to the city, with some justification. Batman vs. Superman, as bad as it was, deals with the consequences of the destruction of Metropolis in Man of Steel, and the question of whether one man should have so much power. And back in the MCU, Captain America Civil War was all about this same issue. Until they figured out who the real bad guy was. Like I said, any story that leans more realistic is doing this at least a little. And superheroes, which descend from comic books and are known for cartoonish antics, are fertile ground for deconstruction. But deconstruction is only one side of the coin. The other side pushes through the deconstruction to build the genre back up again. This is reconstruction. Reconstruction is where you look at the deconstructed tropes and build a plausible, realistic foundation to make them still work. Granting the existence of superpowers, of course. Now you have something that resembles the original trope or genre, but is more grounded in reality. Again, this is something that most modern superhero movies do at least a little, but a classic example is Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight Trilogy. Batman Begins is a reconstruction of the idea of Batman. Why and how would a billionaire, even one who lost his parents traumatically, dress up in a weird costume and run around beating up criminals with his bare hands? Batman Begins answers that. Bruce Wayne doesn't just get messed up enough to become a vigilante. He spends years training in martial arts with an elite group of assassins. He gets mixed up with a plan to destroy Gotham that they already have in progress, so he has to fight them. The Batmobile is an experimental prototype built by his company. And, which is admittedly the same as the comics, he works with the police, at least sometimes, instead of going off on his own as a total vigilante. It's still recognizably Batman, but it's a Batman that explains how he got where he is in a way that makes logical sense. And the tone continues through the other two movies. The Dark Knight discusses how Batman can't keep doing this forever, and he ultimately has to take the fall for Harvey Dent and hang up his cowl, even though he does succeed in cleaning up Gotham. And The Dark Knight Rises delves even deeper into the ultimate fate of a superhero. Again, the once silly world of comic books is fertile ground for this sort of reconstruction. That's the general state of affairs in film, but I think we should take a bit of time to look at the knock-on effects in other media. Of course, video game tie-ins are standard fare for blockbuster films, but there's one other effect of superheroes going mainstream. While superheroes are traditionally a very visual genre in comic books and TV, their newfound popularity has made them viable in a medium that's as far as possible from those visual roots: prose fiction. There had been occasional tie-in novels going all the way back to the early days of comic books. George Lowther's The Adventures of Superman in 1942 codified a lot of the story of Superman's birth, the destruction of Krypton, and his childhood on the Kent farm, which were described in much more detail than in the comics. Later, Elliot S. Maggin wrote Last Son of Krypton in 1978 as a tie-in to the first Superman movie, although it was not a direct novelization. And DC and Marvel have occasionally published novelizations of popular story arcs. But the greater 21st century popularity of superheroes has spawned many original superhero novels, and this allowed the exploration of new ideas that don't fit so well into the narratives of the two major comics publishers. For example, fantasy master Brandon Sanderson began writing the Reckoners series of young adult superhero novels in 2013. In the Reckoners, the government and the heroes have utterly failed to contain the villains after a cosmic event gave a small group of humans powers, called epics in this setting. Each original work seems to want to come up with its own name for supers. Sanderson writes of a world that has become fractured into independent city-states, each ruled by a superpowered epic overlord. Not something you're going to see in traditional comics. The Reckoners are a secret society of normal humans dedicated to killing the epics and taking back the world, which is also something you don't really see in traditional comics. You get badass normals like Batman here and there, but they almost always embrace the superhero lifestyle and are treated on equal footing even with people as powerful as Superman. You don't often have the protagonist explicitly rejecting that lifestyle and still going after villains anyway. So original novels have definitely allowed the genre to explore new directions. The internet also offered new opportunities for superhero stories, as it did for all fiction, with examples like the webcomic/multimedia story Homestuck, and the web serial Worm and its sequel Ward. I'll talk more about web fiction in a later episode, but I feel I would be remiss if I didn't include a plug here for Worm, because I consider it one of the best pieces of fiction I've read. Worm is a web serial, like the old serial novels and magazines, except self-published online, and it really does something new by being a reconstruction of superheroes that is much deeper than any others I've seen. Worm, written by John McCrae, alias Wildbow, is primarily the story of Taylor Hebert, alias Skitter, a teenage girl who has the power to control bugs and leverages it to an almost absurd degree. Skitter wants to be a hero, but is mistaken for a villain and doesn't know how to get out, leading her to fall down the rabbit hole to some truly terrifying places. Now, I do need to give a couple warnings. First, Worm is very dark, and you can safely assume it has all the trigger warnings. This one is not for children. And second, Worm is very long. It's divided into 31 segments called arcs, each of which is worth a novel or at least a novella on its own. And all told, it equals the 5 currently published Game of Thrones books. But I have a much easier challenge for you. I recommend that you read just the first 3 arcs: Gestation, Insinuation, and Agitation. Together, they total only 80,000 words, which is the length of a single normal novel. If you love it as much as I did, you'll want to keep going. On the other hand, if dark and gritty doesn't appeal to you, my latest foray into superhero fiction has been a young adult series called Please Don't Tell My Parents I'm a Supervillain by Richard Roberts. I picked it up because it's well recommended among Worm fans, even though it's completely the opposite. The only similarity is the kid hero getting stuck mistaken for a villain. It's a much lighter story and more of a parody of the superhero genre where the tropes are played for laughs rather than deconstructed. But that very thing makes it a lot of fun. So if you want to go in a more lighthearted direction, this may be the story for you. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and mirrored pretty much everywhere else you're likely to be looking for it. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, and I do still have a science video coming out there soon. I just got hung up on the technical stuff. I'm also on Twitter at SciMeetsFiction, and my own website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. Now, despite those prose recommendations, I do still need to make an official movie recommendation for this episode. And for that, well, honestly, it's hard to beat Avengers Endgame, but there are literally days worth of movies that went into the setup for that. Even excluding sequels, there are a lot of options, but I'm going to go back to the start and go with X-Men 1. It's not the best, it's less polished, and it's campier than a lot of the ones that came later, but X-Men was the movie that introduced the world to superheroes in the way that we think of them today. And I think that's worth another look. In the next episode, we'll dive back into literature, with a new trend that grew into prominence in the 90s and is still going strong. Hard sci-fi stories about the exploration of our own solar system. Thanks for listening.